Chapter 7 deals with the next part of the flow of food, and that is how we store our food. So in this chapter, we're going to look at requirements for labeling and date marking of our food. We're going to talk about rotating food using first in, first out, or FIFO. We're going to talk about temperature requirements for food to store, practices that can prevent temperature abuse during storage and prevent cross-contamination, and guidelines for specific things like meats, poultry, fish, all those fun things. So first and foremost is labeling. All right. So something that you need to be well aware of is that any item that's not in its original container must be labeled. Even if it's, obvious at what it is, it still needs to be labeled if it's not in its original container. And it should include the common name of the food or something that clearly identifies it. All right. It's not necessary to label food if it's clearly will not be mistaken for another item, but things that you think might, it's always better to err on the side of caution. Sugar and salt look very similar to each other. And I don't think I want to use a bunch of salt in my cookies. I'd rather use the sugar for my cookies. So I always recommend that, you're labeling things if they're not in its original container. Okay. Sometimes it's better that way. And once you pull out of a container, it needs to be labeled as well. You open up that can of tomatoes. Okay, if you're not using that entire can of tomatoes, it doesn't stay in the can. It goes into a container, and it does have to be labeled. If you are doing things for retail sale, so not for on-site like a restaurant, but you're doing some retail packaging and stuff, the common name of the food or something that identifies it, the quantity. So is it 8 ounces of product? Is it 2 pieces? Whatever the case may be. If the item contains 2 or more ingredients, you must list the ingredients and any sub-ingredients in descending order by weight. You don't have to put the amounts of stuff, but you do need to label what's going into it and any sub-ingredients. So if you're using soy sauce, you actually need to label the sub-ingredients of what goes into soy sauce if you're packaging for retail sales. Okay, really important because people are going to use those lists to see if there's any allergens or anything along those lines. Okay? List of any artificial colors and flavors or chemical preservatives, the name and place of the business of the manufacturer, packager, or distributor. And then you also should be putting your source of each major food allergen containing the food. So if it contains, dairy, peanuts, whatever, that should all be labeled for retail sale. So date marking. So anything that is ready to eat TCS foods has to be marked if it's held for longer than 24 hours. Okay? The date mark must indicate when the food must be sold, eaten, or thrown out. So according to FDA and state and all that fun stuff, any ready to eat TCS food can be stored for 7 days if it's held at 41 degrees or lower. All right. The count for that 7 days begins the day that food was prepared or that container was open. So those 2 things are the criteria that we look at for that. So for example, we make potato salad on October 1st. The discard date would be October 7th. Okay, so you notice the picture there for the date marking. The use by, it shows you 3/21, 1 p.m. and it's turkey chili is what it says. Now we don't have those cool stickers. You don't necessarily need them. We actually, one of 2 things. We use masking tape. If it's something that's in a reusable container like a Cambro or something like that. If you are using plastic wrap, you can write directly on the plastic wrap as long as it's legible. Okay. But please don't write directly on the Cambro or something along those lines. If it's stored in a bowl and you've got it covered with plastic wrap, you can write on the plastic wrap with what it is. Okay. But it is imperative that we are marking correctly. For one thing, if it's not marked correctly and the health department comes in, we get dinged for it. And since we don't know what it is or when it was put in, it has to be thrown away. On the same lines is we do look through the coolers, the chefs and our student workers. And if there's things that are not marked, they will be pitched, because we don't want the health department coming in and us getting dinged because something was not labeled correctly. So we do need to make sure that their things are being labeled correctly, so that we are not getting in trouble by the health department. So operators use different systems. Some write the day or date the food was prepared. Others write the use by or the date on the label. You want to talk to your sanitarian to see what they are wanting, because it can sometimes vary from county to county. Tazewell County and Peoria County, although we're right next to each other, just a river separates us, there are some distinct differences between the two county health departments and their expectations and stuff. So you need to be proactive and make sure you're communicating with your sanitarian as far as what their expectations are. Remember, like I said in the previous chapter, ignorance is no excuse. You need to make sure you're being proactive about those items. So if it's a commercially processed food, if the processed food has a use by date that is less than 7 days from the date the container was open, then the container should be marked with that use by date, as long as it's the date based on food safety. Okay, so if it's a use by date that's, let's say it's 5 days from now, then you need to make sure it's marked for 5 days from now, not 7 days from now. All right. So you need to make sure that is. Now, if they use, and sometimes if it's a commercially made product, maybe they only say it has a shelf life of 5 days before it should go. You have to use that one, even though you might be 7 days. Right, as long as it's based on a food safety issue. Now, what we need to be conscientious about is if we're combining food. If you're combining food with different use by dates in a dish, base the discard date on the earliest used date. All right. So you see this example here, a shrimp and sausage jambalaya that was prepared on December 4th. Okay. The shrimp has a use by date of December 8th. The sausage has a use by date of December 10th. So the jambalaya needs to be used up by the 8th. You can't use the longer of the two dates. All right. So since the shrimp has a shorter use by date and you made it on the 4th, you have to do it by the use by date of the shrimp, not by the sausage. It's the earlier of the two. When it comes to food coming in, we always want to make sure we are rotating, and we want to use the oldest stuff first, which makes the most sense, right? You don't want to keep pushing the older stuff towards the back, using the newer stuff, and then you finally get to the older stuff, and then it's no good anymore. So the best way to do that is through an acronym called FIFO, F-I-F-O. FIFO stands for first in, first out. Okay. So you do that by identifying the use by or expiration date. Anything that has the earliest use by or expiration date, those are what goes to the front. You want to use those first. Okay. Once they're on the shelves, those are ones we want to use first. And then if it's past its expiration date, we need to make sure we are getting rid of them. So it's really important that we are trying to do that FIFO to make sure that we're using products so we're not having to throw it away and it ends up becoming waste because we weren't doing proper storage or proper rotation of our products. Temperature guidelines. Yeah, I think you've heard this a couple times already, not today, but in previous chapters, but just to reiterate, we want to store any TCS foods at an internal temperature of 41 or lower if it's cold, or 135 or higher if it's hot. Okay. Store meat, poultry, seafood, and dairy items in the coldest part of your walk-in or your storage, your reach-in, away from the door. So you want to keep it towards the back of your reach-in or the back of your walk-in cooler, because it's going to be cooler down there. and it's also going to have less temperature fluctuation. Towards the front of the cooler, whether it be walk in or reach in by where the door is at, you're going to have more temperature fluctuation because you're going to be opening and closing. So it'll get a little bit warmer. Well, the stuff that's, the meats, poultry, dairy, and all that stuff, that we want to keep as cold as possible for as long as possible, because it's going to help with extending the shelf life to make sure it doesn't go bad before we have that use by date that comes along with it. Okay. Of course, frozen food, we want to keep at temperatures that keep it frozen. 0 or below is a good rule of thumb. Make sure that storage units have at least one air temperature measuring device. Those need to be accurate, but to plus or minus 3 degrees. We talked about in the previous chapter. And we want to put it in the warmest part of the refrigerated unit and the coldest part of hot holding units, which is typically towards the front, towards the door, because that's going to have the most temperature fluctuation. Interestingly enough, our walk-in coolers here at the Culinary Institute actually have 2 measuring devices. One is by the door and the other is backed by the condenser. And so you'll see there'll be 2 different readings. One of them, of course, is what it's like there at the door. One of them is at the back of the cooler. So you can see you'll be 1 or 2 degree temperature difference in a lot of instances. When we are filling up our coolers and freezers, we do not want to overload them. If you are overloading them, they're not going to be able to do their job correctly, which means that the product is going to be outside the temperatures we want and be in the temperature danger zone. We want to try to avoid opening the coolers frequently. So we want to try to do as little as possible so we're maintaining a pretty constant temperature. Cold curtains for walk-in coolers or freezers are a nice thing to have, in the fact that they help to keep in that temperature, especially important during the summer when you've got not only heat but humidity. If we can keep that cold air in the coolers, they're going to have to work less, and it's more efficient, less chance of there being issues as far as your coolers and stuff going down. You want to use open shelving. So you want to use shelves. They're not solid shelves. They have, whether they're metal or plastic, they have holes and stuff, or grates, so the air can flow very easily and readily. We want to make sure we're monitoring our temperatures regularly through random samplings of food temperatures, making sure things are at the proper temperature. And if it's not the correct temperature, we need to make sure we're throwing it out, because we don't necessarily know how long it's been at that incorrect temperature. And we also want to make sure we're defrosting our freezers regularly. If they're free of frost, they're more efficient when they are in that situation, and less likely of them going down, because Murphy's Law states if they're going to go down, they're going to go down at probably the most inopportune time for you. As far as preventing cross-contamination, first and foremost, of course, is where we're locating our products. So we want to store food in clean, dry locations away from any dust or contaminants. We never, ever, 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 did I mention ever, store food in locker rooms or dressing rooms. Those are for employees, for changing, for storing their street clothes, things like that. It's not a place to store your extra rice and flour and sugar and stuff. Of course, again, you would hope it would be common sense, but you never know. Never store food in restrooms or in garbage rooms. Do not store them in mechanical rooms. Anywhere there's unshielded sewer lines or leaking water lines, or under stairwells. All of those places are places that you would never want to store food. Health department is pretty specific as far as their requirements for dry storage, refrigeration storage, things along those lines. We need to make sure we're following those, so we are not inadvertently cross-contaminating product that we're going to be sending out to our customer. We've talked, a little about this. If it's damaged, spoiled, or incorrectly stored, we need to make sure that we are discarding unsafe food. If it's been damaged or spoiled, incorrectly stored, missing its date mark, past its date mark, or exceeded time temperature requirements, those need to go bye-bye, because last thing we want to do is serve food that's going to potentially make our customers sick. If we are returning unsafe food to our vendors, Kind of like if there's like a recall, you want to make sure we're storing it away from other food and equipment and label it so it's not used. Now you can see here they use a yellow tag that says do not use, return to vendor. In chapter 6 with the recall, it was a red tag, it said do not use because the product was being recalled. So whatever your system is, just make sure you have a system in place for if you are discarding food, if it's getting returned, or if it's been recalled. Have those things in mind as far as how you're going to handle those. Supply wise, we're going to make sure that we are storing all of our items in the designated storage areas, and we need to store items ideally away from walls as much as we possibly can, and they need to be at least 6 inches off of the floor. Okay, that is a big requirement. That's another one I know you'll see on your tests and things like that down the road. But you need to make sure that when you are storing food, it's stored at least 6 inches off of the floor. Okay. We need to store single-use items like cups, gloves in the original packaging. So, we have our gloves in our kitchens. They are in the containers that the gloves came in. We don't pull them out and put them in a different type of container. We leave them in the same containers that they started off with. When you are using containers, make sure you're storing food in containers intended for food. Just because they look durable doesn't mean they're necessarily good for food storage. Making sure you're using containers that are durable, leak proof, and making sure they will be sealed or covered. You never want to use empty food containers to store chemicals. And please never put food in empty chemical containers. Even though the chemical containers might be nice and sturdy and durable, doesn't mean you want to put food in it. Okay. Again, be thinking about, okay, does this make sense from a sanitation point? Am I going to potentially make somebody sick because how I am storing it? And we want to make sure we're wrapping or covering all of our food correctly as well when it comes to storing stuff in containers, whether it's in the refrigerator, freezer, or in dry storage. Cleaning, we want to make sure our storage areas are clean and dry. Any spills or leaks, we want to make sure we take care of ASAP. Making sure our dollies, carts, transporters, and trays are also clean as well, because those are coming in contact with food and food sources. Store food in containers that have been, of course, cleaned and sanitized, and make sure you're storing dirty linens in non-absorbent containers or washable laundry bags in a separate location, so we're not having to worry about any potential cross-contamination. When we are getting ready to store our products, first and foremost, we want to, again, make sure we wrap or cover our food so we don't get other things into it that on accident that shouldn't be. We want to store raw meat, poultry, and seafood separately from ready to eat food, if at all possible. We are fortunate here at ICC and the Culinary Institute that we have multiple refrigerators. So all of our meats, poultry, and fish has its own refrigerator just for those. Then our non-meat, poultry, and fish, for the most part, goes into our produce cooler. And then we have a separate dairy cooler as well for butter, cheese, milk, other dairy products and stuff too. If it's not possible to store separately, you want to make sure that you are storing ready to eat food above any raw meat, poultry, and seafood. And what this is just to help prevent any juices that might drip going onto the ready to eat foods, right? I mean, hopefully it's not. Hopefully you've got set up where you're not, stuff is not dripping, but you want to hedge your bet. And so your ready to eat foods always go above your raw products. So the storage order, if you have just the one cooler or you're not able to separate raw product, here is the storage order that is required. And this, ladies and gentlemen, please make sure you're memorizing this, not just for testing purposes, but for practical purposes as well. When you get into the kitchen, you have class with me or Chef Keith or somebody, last thing we want to see is you storing raw chicken on the very top shelf and you have a bunch of stuff underneath of it, right? That's a more extreme example, but I've seen it happen before. We want to make sure that we are storing in the proper order. So at the top is any of your ready to eat food. So you can see in this case, it's lettuce. Below any ready to eat foods is seafood. fish or shellfish, seafood. Then below that is whole cuts of beef or pork. And that also includes like steaks, chops, things like that. Then below that is ground meat or ground fish. So that can be ground beef, ground pork, ground pork, no poultry, because poultry goes at the bottom. Ground fish also falls into that category. And then at the very bottom is either whole or ground poultry, all on that same level. So no matter what, poultry, duck, chicken, turkey, any of those bad boys there, those always are stored at the very bottom of everything. Okay. And the reason why they're stored this way is the order is based on the minimum internal cooking temperature for each food. So the further you go down, the higher the minimum internal temperature is going to be as far as cooking is concerned. Right. So you don't want chicken above fish, because the chicken has to be cooked to a higher temperature in order to be considered safe. Well, if that drips on top of the fish and you're not cooking it to the temperature to make it safe for chicken, now you've potentially spread biological contaminant to your customer there. All right. But again, you don't want to cook that fish all the way up to chicken temperature, because you're probably going to have overcooked fish when it comes to that. And so that's why it's in that order, is based upon that internal cooking temperature. But please memorize this order: ready to eat food, seafood, whole cuts, beef, pork, ground meat, ground fish, and then whole and ground poultry at the very bottom. So different food requirements when it comes to these. For example, meat. We want to keep it, of course, internal temperature of 41 or lower. If it's frozen, we want to make sure we keep it frozen. Separate storage unit or coldest part of the cooler as far as location. Try to keep it in airtight, moisture-proof material, or clean and sanitized locations, or hanging off of hooks or racks, depending on where you might be working through. You don't want to store above other food, ideally, again. Eggs, make sure for shell eggs, the air temperature of 45 degrees or lower. Frozen egg items, of course, things keep them frozen. Liquid eggs, whatever the manufacturer recommends. And then if they're dry egg powders and stuff, a cool dry storage area. Of course, the dried egg, once you've mixed with liquid, you do want to store them at 41 or lower. Do not wash shell eggs before you store them. That actually speeds up the process as far as them turning bad on you. Plan to use all shell eggs within 4 to 5 weeks of the packing date. Keep shell eggs in cold storage until you're ready to use, and do not reconstitute more dried egg than you're needed for immediate use. It's not something you want to hold for any period of time. Fresh fish, like the other ones, 41 or below. Frozen fish, make sure to keep it frozen. If possible, keep fillets and steaks in their original packaging. If that's not possible, tightly wrap them in moisture-proof material, plastic wrap, something along those lines. If it's fresh whole fish, it can be packed in crushed ice or flaked ice. You can actually ice them down in ice beds. If you're using an ice bed, though, they need to be self-draining, so the fish is not sitting in the melted ice. They need to be above, and then the melted ice is down below. So it helps to extend that shelf life. Make sure you're changing the ice often, and you're cleaning and sanitizing the container on a regular basis as well. Shucked shellfish is 41 or below. So if they're ready to go, they don't need any other processing. If they're live shellfish, make sure it's an air temperature of 45 or lower. We talked about this last chapter, but you don't want to remove the tag from the container until the last of the shellfish has been used. And then again, you are required by law to keep that tag for 90 days after sale or service. A display tank can be used like for lobsters and stuff, but it does take certain conditions. In most cases, most county health departments require a variance to hold live lobster. So you just can't, buy yourself a tank from the aquarium and start, holding your own lobsters. You actually have to apply and have a variance from the health department in order for that to happen. For produce, if it's TCS foods, then they need to be at 41 or below. Whole citrus fruits, hard rind squash, eggplants, root vegetables can be in a cool, dry area. 60 to 70 is the best. And then, of course, other fruit or vegetables, it just depends on what you are working with. Raw, whole produce, raw cut vegetables, delivered packed in ice can be stored as they are. Just make sure the containers are self-draining, especially if they have ice, and then change the ice regularly. Make sure containers for whole citrus fruit, squash, eggplants, root vegetables are nice and ventilated. It helps to prevent molding and stuff from happening. You want to store onions away from other vegetables that might absorb the odor. That's always interesting. You're biting into an apple and then all of a sudden, this apple has a, onion undertone. Not something that people are necessarily going to find pleasing to their taste buds. With refrigeration, usually coolers are kept at a fairly high humidity, 85 to 90% relative humidity. That's something that typically is built into the refrigerator in and of itself. You don't usually have to make adjustments to that. We do find that some produce will ripen better at room temperature, like avocados, bananas, pears, and tomatoes. If they're not quite ripe, having them out at room temperature will help that happen. When you're getting ready to work with produce, you're going to wash produce just before prepping and serving. You don't want to wash it and then put it in the refrigerator, because chances are it's going to then start molding and deteriorating faster. You wash it and then you use it. Do not mix different items or multiple batches of the same item in standing water or an ice water slurry. It's one of those that, again, trying to keep them separated out. If you're soaking stuff, make sure that you're doing, so let's say you have to take apples and you're going to put them into a acidulated water, some water that has lemon juice in it so it doesn't brown. You want to make sure that they're not putting them all in. So you do a batch, strain it, do the next one, and work your way through. Again, you're just trying to prevent any potential cross-contamination from accidentally happening. Poultry, 41 or below. Frozen poultry, make sure you keep it frozen. If you're removing it from its original package, place it in an airtight container or wrap it in like plastic wrap. Ice pack poultry can be stored in the cooler as long as they're in self-draining containers like the fish, and then you're changing the ice and sanitizing the container on a regular basis. We talked about this last chapter, but if you have ROP, reduced oxygen packaged foods, make sure you're storing them recommended by the manufacturer or at 41 or lower. If there doesn't have a different temperature, it goes along with it. Of course, if it's frozen foods, keep them frozen. If the item is torn, slimy, or contains a lot of liquid, or the item bubbles, you definitely want to throw those bad boys away. And of course, you want to make sure you're checking the expiration date on those ROP items. Anything that is UHT, UHT stands for ultra high temperature. Okay, so ultra high temperature pasteurized in an aseptic packaging. Those are items that, as long as they're not open, can be stored at room temperature. But once you open them, you need to store them at 41 degrees or lower. So you can see, like the little creamers, it's a liquid cream, but it's ultra high temp pasteurized. So they are safe to hold unopened at room temperature. Okay. Once you open, if you open one though, and you have leftover, you can't leave it at room temperature. You need to make sure that it's at 41 degrees or lower. So like it says here, the ultra high temp pasteurized food that's not in the aseptic packaging, you need to make sure that they are at 41 degrees or lower. All right. Canned goods. Thing with canned goods is you do have higher storage temperatures that you can, but you have to be careful, because if it's too warm, it can shorten shelf life. All right. That 60 to 70 degrees is kind of an ideal temperature. If you've got a dry storage that gets into the 90s and stuff in the summer, that will significantly shorten the shelf life of your canned goods. So you want to try to make sure that your dry storage area is pretty consistent throughout the year. And, maybe into the mid 70s at really the highest. You want to keep it on the cooler side. We don't want it as the temperature like your line is working in the middle of a summer type of thing. Some things to take in consideration. Acidic foods do not last as long as low acid foods. So like your canned tomatoes are not going to have as long of a shelf life than your canned green beans or things along those lines. Any cans that are damaged you want to discard. Keep your dry storage area dry, of course, and there's many reasons for that, which we'll get into down the road outside of making sure that your cans aren't coming in contact with moisture and they rusting out or anything like that. Wipe cans clean with a sanitized cloth before opening them. That's a good rule of thumb, just to take your sanitizer towel, which we'll talk about in a different chapter, but taking that and wiping down, especially where you're going to be using the can opener. So you're, again, decreasing the chance of any cross-contamination, just in case there's contaminants on the outside of the can. Dry food, again, higher storage temperatures can shorten shelf life. Check containers or packages. We want to make sure there's no damage from insects or rodents. And if stored correctly, for example, salt and sugar can be held almost indefinitely. Hopefully it doesn't last forever and a day, but there's usually not an expiration date that comes from things like holding salt and holding sugar. So chapter 7, again, another important area when it comes to our product. Our product is in, we've received it, we got it from our vendor. Now we got to make sure we store it. Again, general rule of thumb, first off, first in, first out, FIFO. And then making sure our product is being stored correctly in the proper order. So at the top, ready to eat foods, then fish and seafood, then whole cuts of meat and pork, then ground meat and fish, and then last but not least, poultry at the bottom. And of course, anything we're holding cold, we want to store at 41 degrees or less, and making sure that we are paying attention to expiration dates. If it's a TCS food, we pay attention to the expiration date that's on it. Once it's open, we have 7 days to use it. Unless the expiration date is before that, then we have to mark it with that one instead. Very, very important getting into the storage of our products, so then we can move into the next phase, which is, of course, the preparation.